The station was quiet except for the hum of machines and the low vibration that always ran through the metal floors. The young technician walked down the long corridor carrying her set of tools. She had been assigned to the maintenance bay again, where the armored suits of the soldiers were kept. It was not the first time she worked there, but today her duty felt different because she had been told to take care of the commander's armor. His name was known by everyone on the outpost, but people spoke it with respect and fear. He was a man who rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was heavy with the weight of old battles. She stepped into the bay and found the armor standing on its rack. It looked more like a statue than a piece of equipment. The plating was dark, scarred from many wars, with faint marks that had resisted cleaning even in the past. As she set her tools down and started working, she could not help but study the scratches and lines. Each one seemed to tell a story she did not know. She wiped away dust, polished the surface, and checked the inner joints for damage. It was quiet work, but her thoughts kept circling. What kind of battles had he fought? What had he seen behind those hard eyes? She wanted to ask but never dared. The door opened without warning. She turned and saw him step inside. The commander walked with slow, steady movements, his presence filling the room even without the armor. His gaze passed over her and then settled on the armor she was cleaning. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence pressed on her. She lowered her eyes, feeling unsure, but continued her work. His boots echoed softly as he walked closer. He stopped beside her, and she could sense the weight of his stare even before she looked up. "You clean it well," he said finally. His voice was low, almost a growl, but not unkind. She nodded, surprised he had spoken at all. Most soldiers told stories about how he never wasted words, how he lived only for battle. To hear him notice her work made her chest tighten with a strange feeling. She polished one of the chest plates, catching the dim light from the bay lamps. The metal shone, though the scars remained. She thought about asking him why he never repaired them fully, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Then, as if reading her silence, he leaned closer. His face was lined with age and wear, his eyes deep with something she could not understand. He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt as if he was searching for something in her expression. Then he whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Why don't you treat me like your wife?" Her hand froze on the cloth. For a moment she thought she had misheard. The words did not match the man she knew, the man of iron and command. She looked at him, startled, but he did not move away. His eyes were steady, filled with a sadness that unsettled her. She felt heat rise in her face, not from shame but from confusion. She had never spoken to him outside of her duties. She was only a technician, and he was the commander who carried the lives of many on his shoulders. Why would he say such a thing? She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but her voice would not come. Instead, she stood still, cloth still pressed against the armor while his words echoed in her head. He straightened slowly, his expression unreadable, and looked away toward the wall. The silence grew heavy again, broken only by the hum of machines. She finally lowered her gaze and continued wiping the armor. Though her hands trembled slightly, the work felt different now, as if each motion was being watched, as if each scar she touched carried a memory that belonged to him. The commander said nothing more. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps steady and controlled. When he reached the exit, he paused for a brief moment as if he might speak again, but then he left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss. She stood alone in the bay, cloth in hand, heart beating faster than before. The words he had spoken still lingered, heavy and strange. She wondered if he had mistaken her for someone else, someone from his past. Or perhaps there was more to his silence than anyone knew. She felt a mix of fear and curiosity, knowing that from this moment forward her work with his armor would never feel the same. The technician could not forget his words. They stayed with her long after she had left the maintenance bay, repeating in her mind while she walked the narrow corridors of the outpost. She ate quietly in the mess hall, barely tasting the food. She worked on other soldiers' armor, yet her hands kept remembering the feel of his plates, heavy with scars that refused to be erased. It was not only what he said that troubled her, but the way he had looked at her. His eyes had not carried command in that moment, but a kind of sorrow that made her chest ache with questions. The next morning she returned to the bay early. The commander's armor still stood on its rack, waiting. She began her inspection, running her fingers over the marks and lines. The scratches were deep, older than most of the other suits she had worked on. Some seemed carved rather than caused by battle. She leaned closer, narrowing her eyes, and realized they were not random at all. They were patterns, almost like inscriptions. She traced one with her cloth, noticing faint symbols etched into the surface. They were small, nearly invisible unless someone was looking carefully. Her heart quickened. No soldier would waste time cutting such marks into armor unless they meant something. She began to clean more slowly, paying attention to every corner. Inside the inner joint, she found another mark, this one shaped like a curve with lines crossing through it. She did not know the meaning, but she felt sure it was not just decoration. It was a message, maybe private, maybe sacred. She wondered if it had been done by him or by someone else before her. As she worked, she remembered the way he had whispered to her. It struck her that perhaps he had mistaken her for the one who carved these marks. Perhaps someone had once cared for his armor with the same care she now gave. Perhaps that someone had been his wife. Later in the mess hall, she listened to the soldiers' conversations. They always talked about battles, about alien ships and raids on distant moons. But once in a while his name came up. They said he was unbreakable, that he had led men into wars where no one thought survival was possible. Yet others lowered their voices when speaking of a tragedy. A few claimed he had once fought beside someone close to him, a woman, but she had vanished in a great battle years ago. No one knew for certain, because the commander never spoke of it. Still, the rumor spread like smoke, and many believed it was true. The technician sat quietly, her food untouched, listening. The pieces fit together too well. The armor carried hidden marks. The man carried silence and sorrow. His words to her had not been madness, but memory. Maybe she reminded him of his lost partner, the one who had polished the armor before her. She felt uneasy at the thought. She did not want to be a shadow of someone else, yet she could not deny her curiosity. That evening, she returned to the bay when most were asleep. The lamps hummed softly, throwing long shadows across the racks. She approached his armor again and touched the etched symbols with her fingertips. She wondered what they meant, what story they held. As she bent closer, she whispered softly to herself, "Who were you to him?" The sound of a step behind her made her freeze. She turned quickly, and there he was, standing at the doorway. His eyes were fixed on her, unreadable as always. She felt her heart leap, caught as if she had been doing something forbidden. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked forward, his presence heavy as he stopped before the armor. His hand rose slowly, touching one of the symbols she had been studying. His fingers lingered on it, and his eyes softened for the briefest second. "You see them," he said quietly. His voice was not harsh this time, but tired, almost fragile. She nodded without thinking. He turned his gaze to her, and she felt as if he was measuring whether she was worthy of an answer. But after a pause, he only said, "Not everything can be cleaned away." Before she could ask what he meant, he left, walking into the corridor without another word. She stood there, her hands trembling slightly. His sentence echoed in her mind. Not everything can be cleaned away. She wondered if he was speaking of the armor or of himself. That night, lying in her bunk, she could not sleep. She kept thinking of the commander and his strange behavior. He was a man made of discipline and silence, yet he carried grief so heavy it leaked through his words. She felt a growing pull to understand him, not out of duty but out of something deeper she could not yet name. His armor was no longer just equipment to her. It was a map of scars and secrets, and each time she touched it, she felt she was stepping closer to the truth of the man who wore it. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The technician went about her work as usual, but every time she entered the bay, she felt the weight of his presence even when he was not there. His armor stood tall on its rack, scarred and marked as if it were alive with memory. She found herself cleaning it more carefully than before, not only because it was her duty, but because she felt each motion mattered to him in ways no one else understood. She began to notice his pattern. The commander came to the bay at odd hours, sometimes standing quietly in the shadows as she worked. He never told her to stop, never ordered her away. Instead, he watched. His eyes followed the cloth in her hand, the shine she brought back to the armor. Once or twice he would speak a sing. "Ley line. That mark was from a blade." Or "that scar saved a man's life." His voice was always calm, but the weight behind it told her that these were not only stories of battles. They were fragments of a life he carried inside the iron plates. During the day, she saw him in the command hall. He stood tall before his soldiers, his voice firm and steady as he gave orders. There was no trace of sorrow when he spoke to them, only strength. They respected him, even feared him, because he never hesitated. But when she looked closer, she began to notice the small cracks. His shoulders slumped slightly when he thought no one was watching. His gaze lingered too long on the stars outside the windows, as if searching for something beyond them. To the soldiers, he was an unbreakable leader. To her, he was a man hiding grief behind armor, both metal and flesh. One evening, while she was polishing the chest plate, he entered again. This time he did not stand in silence. He sat on the bench across from her, his eyes fixed on the armor. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of her cloth against the metal filled the air. Finally, his voice broke the stillness. "Do you know why I keep the scars?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. "Because they remind you of something." He nodded slowly. "They remind me of what was lost. They remind me of who I was when the battle ended. If I erase them, I erase her." Her heart tightened. She wanted to ask who he meant, but the way he spoke made the answer clear. His wife, the one the soldiers whispered about. "She fought beside me," he said after a pause, his eyes distant. Her hands touched this armor before every battle. She believed polishing it gave it strength. I told her it was foolish, but still she did it. Every time. The technician listened in silence. She felt her throat grow dry. It was true then. The reason he had looked at her that night, the reason for his strange words. He had seen a reflection of his wife in her simple duty. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharper now. "You think I am mad, don't you? That I speak to ghosts?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I think you carry more than anyone can see." For the first time, his face softened. The hard lines around his mouth eased, and his eyes no longer looked like stone. There was pain, yes, but also something fragile, something almost human beneath the soldier's mask. He stood and placed his hand gently on the armor's shoulder. "Humans survive wars not only with weapons," he said, "but with bonds. Without them, we are empty. Without them, we fight only to fight." She felt his words sink deep into her. He was not teaching her. He was confessing. His battles were not just against enemies, but against the emptiness inside him. When he left the bay that night, she sat alone with the armor. Her hand rested on the cold surface, tracing one of the etched symbols. She no longer saw it as just metal. It was part of his story, part of the pain he carried. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she wanted to help him bear it. In the days that followed, her view of him changed. She still saw the commander who led with iron discipline, but now she also saw the man who whispered to ghosts. Each time she cleaned his armor, she felt she was not only polishing metal but touching fragments of his soul. She began to wonder if she had been chosen for this task by chance, or if there was some hidden meaning in the way fate had placed her here. The commander spoke to her more often now. Always in short sentences, never in long stories, but enough for her to piece together the burden he carried. He told her that bonds gave humans the strength to rise after every fall, but bonds also left them broken when torn away. She realized then that he lived in the space between those truths, held together by memory yet close to breaking. She understood something else too. She was no longer only cleaning armor. She was entering the heart of a man who had forgotten how to live outside of war. And though she was afraid of what it might mean, she could not turn away. The nights on the outpost grew colder, and the technician found herself thinking more about the commander than about the routine of her work. His words stayed with her, the fragments he shared about bonds and battles, about scars and memories. She wanted to know more, yet she also feared what more knowledge might cost. Still, her curiosity grew stronger each day. One evening, she was called to repair a set of old records in the storage section of the base. The data crystals were fragile, filled with years of reports, logs, and personal notes from different officers. As she worked carefully, her eyes caught a file marked with the commander's name. She hesitated, knowing it was not her place, but the thought of his whispered words and his sorrow made her open it. The file was incomplete, fragments of reports and mission logs. Many lines were damaged, but she could read enough to understand. It spoke of a great battle fought years ago on a distant planet. The commander had led his unit into a fight where survival was nearly impossible. Among the names listed in the unit was one that appeared more than once, always close to his own. It was a woman's name, and next to her final entry was a single word: missing. Her heart tightened as she read. This was the truth behind the whispers. His wife had been a soldier, fighting by his side until the day she vanished in that battle. She was not confirmed dead but lost, her fate unknown. The thought of it struck the technician deeply. To lose someone to death was one kind of pain, but to lose them to mystery, to never know if they were alive or gone, was another. It explained his silence, his scars, his clinging to the armor. Later, when she returned to the bay, she looked at the armor differently. She understood now why he had never erased the marks. They were not just scars of war. They were the last traces of the woman he had loved, the one who had cared for his armor before her. The technician felt as if her hands were touching not only metal, but also a memory too sacred to fade. That night, the commander entered the bay again. He stood quietly as always, his eyes resting on her work. After a while, she found the courage to speak. "I saw the records," she said softly. He did not react at first, but his jaw tightened. "You should not read what was not meant for you," he said. She lowered her eyes. "I am sorry. But I understand now. She was the one who cared for this armor before me, wasn't she?" He was silent for a long time. Then he walked closer, his hand brushing across the scarred chest plate. "She believed in small things," he whispered. "She said every piece polished, every mark remembered was a promise. I told her promises break. She said promises live as long as someone keeps them. When she vanished, I kept the scars. They are all I have left of her." The technician listened with a heavy heart. She wanted to comfort him, but she knew her words would never replace what he had lost. Still, she felt the need to speak. "You carry her with you, not only in this armor, but in the way you lead, in the way you survive. That is not weakness. That is strength." His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment she thought she saw gratitude, faint but real. "You speak as she once did," he murmured. The words unsettled her. She did not want to be a shadow of his wife, yet she also realized he was not confusing her with another. He was recognizing something human in her, something that reminded him of bonds he thought were lost. In the days that followed, their unspoken bond deepened. He spoke to her more often, not of strategy or orders, but of fragments from the past. A battle where laughter had echoed in the camp before dawn. A mission where two soldiers had argued over who would polish the armor first. He never said her name, but the technician understood who he was speaking of. She also began to question herself. Was she helping him heal, or was she only replacing someone he could not let go? The thought worried her, but she did not stop her work. Each time she polished the armor, she felt she was helping him breathe again, even if only a little. One evening, when she was leaving the bay, he stopped her at the door. His voice was calm but heavy. "You should know something," he said. "She did not vanish in silence. She vanished saving me. Every scar on this armor reminds me that I lived while she was taken. That is the truth I carry." The technician felt her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him it was not his fault, that no one could bear such a burden alone, but she only nodded, knowing her words would never change the past. As she walked away, she realized she was no longer only a technician. She was now part of his struggle, part of the silent war he fought each day with memory and loss. The alarm sounded across the outpost one cold morning, its sharp cry breaking the stillness of routine. Soldiers rushed to their stations, the halls echoing with hurried footsteps and urgent voices. The technician, startled from her workbench, looked up at the flashing red lights. It had been months since the last attack, and everyone had begun to believe the enemy would not return so soon. But the alarm was clear. Trouble was here. She ran to the maintenance bay, knowing her duty. The commander's armor stood ready, polished and strong, though scarred with history. She felt her hands tremble as she touched it one last time before he arrived. The symbols glimmered faintly under the emergency lights, as if they too were preparing for battle. The door hissed open and the commander stepped in. His face was calm, though his eyes burned with focus. Without a word, he moved to the armor. She helped him fit the plates in place, her hands working quickly, her heart racing. She fastened the chest piece, adjusted the shoulder guard, and locked the helmet seal. The weight of the armor seemed to sink into the floor, but on him it looked like it belonged. When she finished, he placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Stay in the bay," he said, his voice steady. "You are safe here." She wanted to answer, to tell him to be careful, but the words caught in her throat. He turned and marched out, his armored boots striking hard against the metal floor. For a moment she stood frozen, staring after him. Then she moved to the control screen, watching as alerts filled the display. The enemy had breached the outer defense, their ships dropping soldiers onto the surface. The battle was coming fast. Through the monitor, she caught glimpses of him. The commander stood at the front lines, his dark armor shining under the harsh lights. His voice carried across the comms, clear and commanding, guiding his men with precision. She had seen him as a man haunted by loss, but now she saw him as the leader who had survived countless wars. His soldiers followed him without hesitation, their courage drawn from his unshakable presence. The fight began. Explosions shook the ground and the walls trembled with the force of impact. The technician gripped the edge of the console, watching as the commander charged forward, his armor catching firelight and smoke. Every move he made was deliberate, every strike with purpose. He fought not only with strength, but with the weight of every bond he had ever carried. The technician felt her heart pound as she watched him shield his men, taking blows that would have ended them. She remembered the scars she had polished, the symbols carved into the metal. Now she understood them in a new way. They were not just reminders of loss, they were proof of survival. Proof that even when torn apart, he still stood. Suddenly, an enemy strike broke through the outer wall of the outpost, sending debris flying into the maintenance bay. She ducked behind the rack as sparks rained around her. The sound of battle was closer now, the roar of weapons filling the air. She knew she should stay hidden, but she could not help but rise and look toward the corridor. And there he was. The commander burst through the smoke, leading his men against the invaders who had breached the hall. His armor glowed with fire and dust, yet he moved with unshaken purpose. In that moment, she saw not only the man who had whispered sorrow in the quiet of the bay, but the warrior who refused to break. One of the attackers aimed at her as she stood frozen in the doorway. Her breath caught, her body stiff with fear. Before she could move, the commander turned, placing himself between her and the strike. The blast hit his armor, the impact ringing through the bay. He staggered but did not fall, raising his weapon and cutting down the enemy in return. "Stay back," he shouted to her, his voice sharper than ever before. She stumbled behind the console, her chest tight with fear. Yet in her heart she felt something else. He had shielded her, not out of duty alone, but out of something deeper. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, though only minutes passed. Finally, the enemy began to retreat, their numbers broken by the commander's relentless assault. His soldiers cheered as the remaining invaders fled into the smoke. The alarm grew softer, the lights dimmed, and the outpost slowly settled into silence once more. When the commander returned to the bay, his armor was scarred with fresh marks, smoke still rising from its plates. He removed his helmet, revealing sweat and blood on his face, but his eyes were steady. She rushed to him, her hands reaching as if to help, but he raised one hand to stop her. "I am alive," he said simply. She swallowed hard, her relief flooding through her. She wanted to ask why he had shielded her, why he had risked himself for her, but the answer was already there in his gaze. His words that night had not been madness. They had been truth. He could not stop himself from protecting what he valued, even if he did not yet understand what she meant to him. As she helped him remove the armor, she traced her hand over the new scars. Another story had been written into the plates, another memory that would never fade, and she knew deep in her heart that this battle had changed something between them. She was no longer just the one who cleaned his armor. She had become part of the bond that gave him the strength to fight. The outpost was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier than before. Smoke still clung to the halls and the smell of burnt metal lingered in the air. The soldiers moved with tired steps, cleaning debris and repairing walls. Victory had been theirs, yet it had left behind wounds both seen and unseen. The technician sat in the maintenance bay, waiting. On the rack before her stood the commander's armor, scarred from the battle. New marks crossed over old ones, deep and jagged, as if the armor itself had fought to stay alive. She touched one of the fresh burns with her fingers, her heart tightening. Every scar was proof he had stood between her and danger. The door opened and the commander stepped inside. He moved more slowly than usual, his body weighed down by the fight. His face was pale and his arm hung stiffly at his side. She hurried to him, but he raised his hand to stop her. "I will manage," he said, though his voice was weaker than before. She ignored his protest and guided him to the bench. He allowed it, perhaps too tired to resist. She brought a cloth and water, cleaning the streaks of dirt and blood from his face. He sat still, his eyes closed, as if the touch reminded him of something long forgotten. "You should not have shielded me," she said quietly. "You put yourself in danger." His eyes opened, sharp and steady. "It was not a choice. It was instinct. I could not let harm reach you." Her breath caught at his words. She wanted to ask why, but part of her already knew the answer. As she worked on the armor, he watched her in silence. Then he spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard. I do not know where the memory ends and where the present begins. Sometimes when I see you, I remember her. Sometimes when you touch the armor, I hear her voice. It is a weight I cannot escape. She paused, her hand resting on the scarred plate. You are not alone in that weight, she said gently. But I am not her. I cannot be her. He looked at her for a long time. His eyes were tired, but there was a spark in them, a faint light struggling to stay alive. Then who are you to me? He asked. She took a breath, steadying herself. I am someone who wants to remind you that life is still here, that bonds can still be made, that your scars do not have to hold only sorrow. His gaze lowered, and for a moment he seemed lost. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When she vanished, I told myself the war had taken everything. I led because I had nothing else left to lose. But when you stood in the hall, when I saw that strike aimed at you, I felt the same fear I thought was buried forever. The fear of losing someone I could not protect. The technician felt her chest ache with his words. She placed her hand gently on his armored shoulder. You protected me, and you are still here. That means something. He was silent, but he did not move away from her touch. Slowly, he nodded as if accepting a truth he had long denied. In the days that followed, his recovery was slow. He trained his men with the same strict discipline, but in the quiet moments he allowed himself to rest. The technician remained by his side, repairing his armor piece by piece, polishing each scar until it shone. She began to notice small changes in him. He no longer watched her with the same haunted eyes. Instead, there was a faint calm, as if he was learning to see her for who she was, not only as a shadow of the one he had lost. One evening, as she finished her work, he spoke again. The war will not end soon. We will fight again and many will fall. I cannot promise survival. She looked at him and answered simply, I do not need promises. I only need to know that while we live as ourselves. His lips curved into the smallest trace of a smile. Something so he had never seen from him before. It was faint, fragile, but real. That night, as he left the bay, she felt something had shifted. He was no longer bound only to the past. He was beginning to step into the present, guided not by memory alone, but by the bond forming between them. The technician lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the scars she had polished, the weight of his sorrow, and the way he had looked at her tonight. She knew the war was far from over, but she also knew that something had changed between them. He no longer whispered to ghosts alone. He was learning to speak to the living again, and she would not turn away from that fragile step, no matter how uncertain the path ahead. The war stretched on, but the outpost had become more than a battlefield. For the soldiers, it was a home built out of scraps of hope and discipline. For the technician, it was a place where her hands gave life back to broken machines and to a commander whose scars ran deeper than steel. The commander had changed. His voice still carried strength and his orders were sharp, but there was a difference in the way he stood among his men. His eyes no longer carried only grief. Now they carried resolve. When he spoke, the soldiers did not just hear command, they felt purpose. The technician noticed these changes in the small moments. He would pause when passing her in the hall, as if to check that she was safe. He no longer sat apart during meals but joined his men, speaking few words yet sharing their company. His presence became a pillar that held the unit together, but it was no longer built only from sorrow. It carried quiet hope. One evening, the sky outside the dome burned orange with the fading light of the twin suns. The technician sat with the commander in the maintenance bay, polishing the last of the armor plates. The marks of battle were still there, but she had smoothed them until they reflected the dim light. You will fight again tomorrow, she said softly, though her hands did not stop working. Yes, he answered. Another wave is coming. The scouts say their numbers are larger this time. She pressed her lips together, her fingers trembling slightly. And if you do not return? He looked at her, his gaze steady but gentle. Then I ask you to remember me not as a shadow of the past, but as the man who found a reason to keep standing. Her eyes watered, but she smiled faintly. And what reason is that? He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret meant only for her. You, and the life that still waits beyond war. Her heart tightened at his words. She had waited for him to see her not as a reflection of the one he had lost, but as herself. Now, in his quiet way, he had given her that answer. The alarm rang through the outpost the next morning. The enemy had come, their ships blackening the sky. Soldiers rushed into position, weapons ready, while the commander donned his armor once more. The technician fastened the last clasp, her hand steady this time, though fear beat inside her chest. "Return to me," she whispered. He placed his hand over hers, armored fingers cold against her skin. "I will do all I can." Then he left, leading his men into the storm. The battle raged harder than before. Explosions shook the ground and the air filled with fire and metal. The enemy pressed forward in endless waves, but the commander stood like a wall before them, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers rallied around him, their courage drawn from his unshaken will. From the safety of the bay, the technician watched through the screens. She saw his figure move across the battlefield, every strike precise, every command clear. He seemed larger than life, but she knew he was only a man carrying the weight of many lives. Hours passed, and still the fight raged. At last, when the sky was filled with smoke and the enemy retreated into the distance, the soldiers raised their weapons high in victory. The commander returned, his armor dented and burned, but his steps strong. The technician ran to meet him, relief flooding through her. He removed his helmet, his face streaked with sweat and dust, but his eyes steady. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would do all I could," he replied. For a moment, they simply stood there, the noise of the soldiers cheering around them fading into the background. It was as if the world had narrowed to the space between them. That night, when the outpost grew quiet, the commander and the technician sat side by side beneath the dome. Above them, stars spread across the dark sky, endless and bright. "I do not know how long this war will last," he said, "but I know now that it will not take everything from me." She turned her head toward him. "Because you still have something worth keeping," he nodded. "Because I still have you." The technician felt warmth spread through her chest. The war would come again, and the days ahead would be harsh. But in that moment, beneath the stars, she understood something important. Survival was not just about fighting. It was about remembering why they fought at all. The commander reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not desperate as before. It was a promise, unspoken but clear. And for the first time since the war had begun, the technician felt that the future, though uncertain, carried not only fear, but also hope.